Charters Towers is a small gold mining town located in North Queensland. In its heyday, it was a thriving city second only to Brisbane. With its wealth, infrastructure and services, it became known as the world. From the discovery of gold in 1871 through the mining boom, wars until present day, many men and women have contributed to the 150 years of Charters Towers. These men and women have left their mark on history and continue to inspire us today. Here are some of their stories. So much about Jupiter Mossman has been confused by myth and time that it's hard to know who the real man was. He is believed to have been born in northwestern Queensland and came to live at Kainoona Station south of Julia Creek. When station owner and gold prospector Hugh Mossman came to visit Kainoona, he apparently took a liking to the lad and so acquired him, taking him away from his home and family back to Thornbra Station. According to stories, Hugh gave his young charge the name Jupiter because his large, luminous eyes reminded him of the planet. His real name, family and tribal background are not known, nor how he came to be acquired. Hugh eventually sold his station and journeyed north, joining with George Clark and John Fraser, exploring the area around Ravenswood and further east. The story of the first gold discovery in 1871 that sparked the rush to Charters Towers is now legend. It tells how the party were camped about a mile from the current town area when a storm came up and startled the horses, who then bolted into the bush. The party dispersed to find them, probably the following morning, including young Jupiter, who was believed to be around 8 to 10 years old at the time. Following a natural causeway between some hills, Jupiter found a horse, then dropped down into a watercourse at the base of one of the hills for a drink. Noticing some quartz in the water, he quickly spotted some colour in the quartz, mining talk for gold, and gathered some up to take back to Hugh and the rest of the party. He led them back to the alluvial gold and they followed the creek to a large quartz outcrop. The finding wasn't reported until the following year, but once registered, things quickly snowballed. The rocky outcrop became the North Australian Mine, and gold seekers flocked to the area, and a town sprang up with stores, banks, hotels and more mines popping up in every direction. The small amount of alluvial gold was quickly exhausted, so deeper reef mines were sunk and towering poppet heads dotted the landscape. The new town was named after William Charters, the gold commissioner at the time. Some claim the Towers part of the name comes from the towers or tors of the hilly area. Others claim it was named wholly for the Charters' ancestral home in Ireland called Charters Towers. In all of this heady rush, Jupiter's part of the initial discovery was overlooked for many years. Official accounts only mentioned Hugh Mossman, Clark and Fraser, and their lucky stumble onto the gold. As Jupiter grew up, he went with Hugh to Sydney, where he was sent to Newton and Lyndhurst College, where he gained an education and displayed a great aptitude for football, cricket and running. Years later, on his return to Charters Towers, his skill at both sports saw him play for the Queen's team at cricket and football with the Imps. He often told the local boys about the time he came across the quartz stone that opened the Charters Towers goldfield. After Hugh left the Towers around 1891, Jupiter returned to the bush, taking work as a drover, moving a large head of cattle from Kainoona Station to Wodonga, Victoria, a journey which took over 6 months. Later, he worked around the Charters Towers district at Lulworth, Dotswood, Wambiana and Stockyard Creek stations as a station hand. He was an excellent rider and horseman. Gold fever never really left his blood though, and he continued prospecting for most of his life. He is credited with the discovery of several auriferous areas in the peninsula, as well as wolfram at Kangaroo Hills and Stockyard Creek. However, Jupiter gained little money and no real recognition for these or his earlier discoveries. Becoming ill as he grew older, Jupiter was admitted to Eventide in 1937. Aged in his 80s, he would often walk around town from Eventide, especially going out to Corinda, a small settlement near the current-day airport, to visit friends. He was described by many as a man of innate courtesy and dignity, with a natural presence. Interviewed in the 1940s, He told the reporter that he still missed the bush and dreamed of going prospecting again with a horse and a pack. He died at Eventide on the 5th of December 1945, aged approximately 84 years of age. Gradually, the story of Jupiter and the discovery of gold gained popularity and recognition, with many memorials scattered around the town. While it never led to riches for the initial discoverer, Jupiter Mossman left Charters Towers with a foundation of gold and the memory of a man who has become a legend himself. From the relatively humble beginning as the son of a lace thread manufacturer, Edmund Harris Thornbra Plant went on to make himself into one of the most successful businessmen in Charters Towers. His original intention was to pursue pastoral occupations, and he worked on various stations in and around central and southern Queensland for 2 years before he took to the Rockhampton goldfields with a partner, George Jackson. When the Northern Goldfield opened, he and George followed the rush, first landing in Ravenswood in 1869, where he and George set up the first ore-crushing battery in the area, the Vulcan Mill. When gold was discovered in Charters Towers in 1871, he and his partner shifted their operations to Milchester, only to find that no one had yet set up any mills. All the ore had been sent away for crushing. He bought a mill in Cleveland Bay and had it carted over the rough bush tracks to Milchester. Having a machine to treat the ore so soon after extraction on such a new field was almost unheard of, and his mill flourished. He built the Venus Mill, which he sold in 1872 to James Hutton, with a goodwill agreement not to set up another mill within 20 miles of Charters Towers. Plant moved back to Ravenswood, but by 1883 wanted to set up milling in the Towers again, so paid Hutton the balance of the bond and moved his tailings mill from Ravenswood to Lower Mossman Street. Initially just a tailings treatment plant, which was quite successful at extracting further gold from tailings previously treated, after 6 years he added batteries to his mill and commenced crushing as well. The dam, created for his mill, filled the area now occupied by the lower sports oval of Blackheath and Thornbra School, and made a picturesque end to dry and dusty Mossman Street. He sold the mill to Bonnie Dundee Gold Mining Company, remaining as managing director, and moved on to a Pyrades Works, partnered with J.B. Whitehead. During this time, Plant's businesses boomed, and to reflect his growing wealth and status in the town, he had Thornbra House built in 1890 to overlook his mill and dam, and named it for his mother's family. Described as the largest and most handsome villa residence in the north, it was constructed with his beloved and growing family in mind. Plant had married Elizabeth Esther Hodel of Townsville and produced 8 children. At Thornbra House, there was a schoolroom on the ground floor, with a separate staircase to the children's bedroom and nursery, while the basement housed a playroom and skating rink. The extensive grounds were beautifully landscaped and allowed plenty of room for the children to play. The gracious home became a social hub for the upper echelon of Charters Towers society, as Plant was a member of many local boards. He was also general manager of several mining companies and owned cattle stations all around the state. Plant lived at Thornbra House for 30 years with his family and was a popular and prominent citizen of the town. When the Charters Towers gold mines began their decline after 1900, Plant made one last bid to secure the gold future of the town and invested in the Day Dawn Deep Mine on Marion Street. It was not a successful venture. Plant eventually decided to live out his final years in the south. He retired first to Goose Lagoon, his sugar farm near Ingham, having sold off many of his stations after 1912, then moved to Sandgate in Brisbane, where he died in 1926, aged 82. In Charters Towers, he was remembered as a capable and progressive self-taught engineer, said to have been the first man to install electricity both domestically and industrially in the town, and was seen as upright, honourable, and unassuming. When he left the Towers, he arranged the sale of Thornbra House to a committee formed by the local Methodist and Presbyterian churches for just £3,000 as a charitable gesture, so they could use it for the accommodation and classrooms of a college. 11 boys attended the first class at Thornbra College in 1919. The official opening of the school took place on April 23, 1920, and enrolments rapidly increased and required the college to be modified to add extra classrooms and accommodation. Along with Thornbra, the girls' campus, Blackheath, was opened on nearby Stubley Street in 1921, in a house known as Yelvertoft, former residence of David Ralston, part owner of the Venus Mill. Plant's driving force as a miner and processor and his investment in the town helped to prolong the success and prosperity of Charters Towers, with an added legacy in the thriving education field through his assistance in establishing the college now known as Blackheath and Thornbra. The life of Thomas Buckland was a true rags-to-riches story. Born in England in 1848 to farmers John and Martha Buckland, the family migrated to Sydney in the 1860s, where young Thomas was sent to work for his uncle Thomas at the Waterloo warehouse. He was soon transferred to Victoria to work in his uncle's assaying business, and there acquired the skills that would shape his life. Arriving on the Charters Towers field in 1872, aged 24, he set up at the main settlement at Gladstone Creek in Milchester. Thomas set up his assaying business facing McDonald Street. He was one of the first assayers on the field, and cornering the early market meant great success. Life on the fields was dangerous in those early days. Luckily, Thomas avoided the infamous meat riots of 1873 by a close shave. A local butcher, Trevarthen, had increased his meat prices by a large margin, and the miners were not having it. Feelings ran high, and the mob decided to march to his shop and pull it down as punishment. Buckland told the story years later, how that day he was working on a parcel of gold amounting to 1,700 ounces, smelting it in his humble shack alongside the manager of the local branch of the Bank of New South Wales. The rioting miners streamed by the sapling and bark office, not realising that a few feet away, 5,000 or 6,000 pounds worth of gold was in the charge of two young men. He said he and the other fellow did their best to conceal their task, but carried on as the men passed them by. What a feeling of relief when the gold was finally lodged safely in the bank just across the street. As Buckland's success grew, he expanded his operations and purchased the old Tattersalls Hotel in Charters Towers, on the corner of Mossman and Elizabeth Streets, and opened his assay office there, as well as purchasing Defiance Mill so he could now crush the ore, assay and smelt the gold himself. He had another grand building constructed further along Mossman Street. Downstairs was a saddle and harness maker, and more offices for hire upstairs. He'd also purchased a cottage in Gill Street, close to the intersection of Gill and Church Streets, and moved into the town proper. He even owned a newspaper, the Towers Herald, for a time. Buckland bought interests in mills and in cattle stations during these years. He handed over the management of all these businesses to a slew of managers, and continued to buy and sell assets as the market demanded. His success wasn't admired by everyone. In 1877 and 1883, he sued the editor and owner of the Northern Miner for Dias Okane. In another protracted court case, he sued for defamation and libel when Okane published several articles in the paper strongly implying that Buckland had had some involvement in the robbery of a retort of gold from the Daydawn-owned Excelsior quartz crushing machine. Buckland won the case, and Okane was forced to pay a large fee. The libel case did not seem to have soured his involvement in the town. He was a member of the Charters Towers Municipal Council and served as mayor for 2 terms in 1882 and 1883, as well as board member of many local committees and associations. He married Mary Kirkpatrick in 1890 and they had 7 children. Although Buckland returned to Charters Towers regularly over the following years to manage his business interests, he ultimately moved to Sydney sometime around 1894. There, he had a magnificent home built at Hunters Hill he named Lyndhurst, with spectacular views across the harbour to the city. His son Godfrey worked for some time as stockman on Cardigan Station around 1909, but when war broke out in 1914, while the family were on a visit to England, he stayed behind and enlisted. He was killed in action in France a year later. At the age of 60, Buckland changed his focus to directorships and became director of many prominent companies, and eventually the president of the Bank of New South Wales from 1922 to 1937. During this time, he engaged in philanthropic work, building and endowing boys' homes and convalescent hospitals with large sums of money. Sir Thomas Buckland was knighted in 1935 for his services to Australia, and he continued his philanthropic works, donating money to the Commonwealth Government to purchase 2 bombers for the defence of Australia during World War II. Part of the condition of his donation was that he would get a ride in one of them. And he did, at age 80. Buckland died in 1947, aged 99, and the value of his estate was estimated to be close to £600,000. Much of his estate was left to beneficiaries. He was renowned throughout Australia for his hard work and generous nature. For every success story of the goldfields, like EHT Plant and Thomas Buckland, there is a story like Frank Stubley's, although not many quite reach the giddy heights, then plunge to the dramatic depths like he did. Francis Horace Stubley was born in Sydney in 1844 to Leonard and Mary Stubley. The family, including Frank's sister Mary, moved to Victoria, living in Warrnambool from 1866. In 1870, Frank is listed in the Warrnambool Business Directory as a merchant, produce dealer, shipping commission and forwarding agent, as well as the Ferry Street and Tramway Terminus agent for Grover, Baker and Baker's Sewing Machines. Unfortunately, he was also listed as insolvent that same year and left Warrnambool to head to the Peak Downs District Gold Rush in central Queensland. When the rush changed direction to Charters Towers, he followed in 1872. Once in Charters Towers, he tried his luck on at least 13 claims, but finally struck it rich on the St Patrick Reef mines, where he'd bought a share along with Kirk, Walker, He-Her, Buckland and Scott. By 1878, the St Patrick mines were producing more gold than any other reef, and along with his interests in other mines and mills, including the Queen mines, Frank was soon making a rumoured £1,500 to £2,000 a week. In 1876, he bought a share in the Defiance Mill with Thomas Buckland, and in 8 years he made over £200,000 from these mines and mills, as well as interests in mines all over Australia. Frank Stubley was described as a very rich and very generous man. He was apparently in the habit of shouting drinks to everyone at the bar and held large dinners at the local hotels. Many described the large entourage of young miners who took to hanging around with Frank in hopes of benefiting from his generosity. Rising rapidly into the upper levels of society, Stubley became president of the Jockey Club, the Cricket Club, and chairman of the Goldfields Committee. He gifted the Catholic Church with a Big Ben bell for their new location on Gill Street. This generosity and local interest built Stubley's popularity so much that he was nominated to run for the seat of Kennedy in the Legislative Assembly. He held a seat from 1873 to 1878, then won a second term in 1878 with one of the most overwhelming majorities in this region to that date. His speeches were apparently so witty that large crowds would fill the Oddfellows Hall literally to the rafters. Some journalists wrote bitingly of his lack of experience and habit of making grand promises he couldn't hope to fulfill, and perhaps the voters began to agree, for he lost his seat to Isidor Listener in 1883. Meanwhile, Stubley continued to invest his fortune in a variety of speculations. He invested in the first diamond borer on the goldfields, which he had brought over from England, but it didn't meet with much success, as many miners didn't believe that deep mining was worth the expense and effort for the type of gold geology in the Charters Towers field. Stubley was actually right, and some years later this deep shaft mining became the main method used to extend the life of the gold mines of the town. In 1878, aged 34, Stubley had married Evelyn Musson, just 17 years old, in Sydney, and together they had 3 children. Around this time, Stubley broadened his investments to cattle stations. One he bought outside of Herberton he named Evelyn, after his young wife. He also purchased Glencoe and St Anne's stations. All the while, he was still operating his other export and trade businesses out of Melbourne as Stubley & Co. These business speculations, paired with his overly generous nature, taste for the high life and gambling habits, meant the good times could not last, and he soon frittered away his rapidly acquired fortune. He apparently once lost £15,000 at one race meeting, and it was said he lit his pipe with £10 notes, saying having so many of them were a burden to him. In 1884, Stubley appeared in the Melbourne Insolvency Court. When asked to provide evidence of his expenditures, Stubley stated he hadn't kept any records for his mining or cattle stations and hadn't even kept the counterfoils of his checkbooks. His assets were sold off, including Glencoe and St Anne's stations, to Thomas Buckland. All his properties were mortgaged, but he still owed the bank £30,000, as well as £12,000 to Forward Brothers of London for shipping loans. Stubley was briefly jailed after he refused to disclose to the court what had become of a large amount of jewellery he'd bought over the years for his wife. He was soon released from custody, and his assets were disposed of. His interests in the Defiance Mill, St Patrick, and other local mines were sold for just £7,100. 2 years after his fall from grace, in February 1886, Stubley set out with a party of 10 people travelling from Normanton to Croydon. The rough track passed through some of the driest and most desolate country in the district, and at that time of year, temperatures were recorded as being around 46 degrees. After 2 days of travel in that intense heat, Stubley called out to the party to stop, as he wasn't feeling well. He dismounted from his horse and had a drink. The group rested for several hours, then continued on, but Stubley soon stopped them again. A witness from the travelling party described him as disoriented and possibly hallucinating, saying he seemed to think he was playing a game of pool. When he tried to remount his horse, he fell and was caught by some of the men. They lay him in the shade of one of the drays, but shortly afterwards he died. The party had no choice but to bury him by the roadside, but it is believed his companions returned at a later date and had his remains properly buried in the Normanton Cemetery. He was 42 years old. The Northern Miner wrote an article about a month later on the sad end of Frank Stubley's meteoric rise and fall. Free-handed and reckless, he had grand opportunities, and it must be admitted by his best friends, he made the worst possible by them. Like many a man raised from a humble position to sudden wealth, poor Frank lost his head and launched out into all kinds of foolish speculations. The end of such a career was inevitable. His estate melted away. For the last 4 years, he has been living on the reflection of his past greatness. In the days of his prosperity, he was universally popular while he had money. He visited Charters Towers a month ago, and he was in good health. He left for Normanton, on his way to the Croydon Rush. It is a sad fate to die in the lonely bush of Sunstroke, far away from wife and children. Isidor Listener came to the Charters Towers goldfields in 1873 and became an integral part of the town for many years, first as a storekeeper and miner, then as a member of council and member for Kennedy. Described as a small, slight man, Isidor was born in Prussia, possibly in 1832. A German Jew, he emigrated to the Bendigo goldfields in 1856, then moved on to the New Zealand goldfields and ended up in Charters Towers via a brief stop in Ravenswood. He set up his wholesale and retail general goods store in Mossman Street, on the site of the current World Theatre. The success of his business, along with his interests in several mining leases in Charters Towers, Croydon, Hodgkinson and Chillagoe, saw him rise in prominence in the town. Isidor was generally acknowledged as a very generous man, allowing customers to run up credit at his store. Isidor later sold the store to another prominent business owner, Burns Philp, and with his mining interests prospering, he entered local politics. He had long been a promoter and supporter of sport and recreation in the town, and a member of the hospital board. Once he was elected to the local council, he went on to be elected as the junior member for Kennedy from 1883 to 1893. He advocated for many important improvements in the town, including the development of the rail network, better education of the miners, the establishment of the School of Mines, and the provision of better public amenities. Isidor and Dias Okane, the well-renowned editor of the Northern Miner, were instrumental in the development of the town reserve, which eventually became Listener Park. They were keen on the idea of a recreational and botanical space in a town otherwise occupied by noisy, dusty mining operations. Grants were obtained in 1885 and 1889 to develop the reserve into a park, and although the Botanic Gardens never quite eventuated, avenues of trees were planted and injured or orphaned native animals were kept in enclosures and became a feature of the park. At one time there were emus, kangaroos and wallabies, deer, flying foxes, swans and more. The popular duck pond still exists in the park today, and an enclosure of emus and kangaroos was kept on the site of the current heated pool until the late 1980s. Cricket pitches and tennis courts were built in the park and were popular throughout the early part of the 1900s. The band Rotunda, which still stands today, was erected in 1903, and many outdoor concerts were enjoyed by local crowds. A kiosk was even built in 1910 to cater for picnicking families. The park became a major gathering place for the locals, a meeting place and celebration site. The beautiful Boer War kiosk was constructed around 1903 and became the centre point for these celebrations. A large gathering was held there in 1946 for the Victory Day celebration after World War II. Isidor died in Brisbane in 1902, survived by his 4 children. He was held in such high esteem right across Queensland that his funeral was attended by the state premier, most of the cabinet and stock exchange, and many prominent members of the German community. The Brisbane Courier stated on the 23rd of July 1902 that the death of Mr. Listener, who at one time was a prominent northern member in the Parliament of Queensland, is a reminder that the development of this state has been helped by many nationalities. Mr. Listener represented the activity of Germany in this land, but he had cast his lot in with us so fully that his interests and those of Queensland were identical. We owe a great deal to the enterprise and energy of such men. Listener impressed people with his thoroughgoing honest and earnestness. Northern Queensland is being settled today because of the foundations laid by the pioneers of Mr. Listener's stamp. The Evening Telegraph newspaper of Charters Towers reported in his obituary, "All Queensland knew the little man of merry quip and jest, underlying which was a great knowledge of humanity. All while he lived had conscientious words of praise for him. Listener ever took the good and bad in life cheerily, and when the end was something that could not be put aside, he met it with the same cheerful spirit." The local stock exchange was closed on the day of his death out of respect for this beloved local figure. There are few people from the early days of Charters Towers who are remembered as such a colourful and vivid personality as the owner and editor of the Northern Miner, Dias Okane. Born in Dingle, Ireland in 1820 and christened Timothy Joseph, Okane was the youngest of 14 children. He attended Maynooth College with the intention of entering the priesthood, but after 7 years he left and moved to London to pursue journalism. He left England for Australia, changing his name to Dias. In 1865, he was the sub-editor of the North Australian in Ipswich, then moved to Rockhampton, where he taught at a school and sub-edited the Morning Bulletin until 1872. When the Charters Towers goldfields opened that year, he packed up and moved north, arriving in Milchester in 1873, where he bought a half share of a small newspaper called the Northern Miner. The following year, he bought out the entire paper and moved the printing plant into the Upper Camp, which became the town of Charters Towers. Dias Okane had a gift for radical journalism and never pulled his punches when writing against situations he saw as wrong or corrupt. The first of many libel cases filed against him came just a month after he took over the editorial duties. Many of his cases ended in a nominal award to the plaintiff, perhaps a reflection that the juries didn't always entirely disagree with Okane's comments, but knew there had to be some limit to their expressions in such a public forum. Okane had ongoing disputes with many of the prominent men of the town. By 1881, Okane widely held the public support and had won or drawn most of the libel cases filed against him. Many more were to follow, sometimes with Okane as plaintiff, but most often as defendant. He never hesitated to use his voice and public platform to call out citizens, lawyers, and even a judge for his perception of their wrongdoings. A vicious and personal battle in 1882 with lawyer William Morgan, who had previously defended Okane in several of his cases, ended with the jury agreeing to Morgan's application to bind Okane to keep the peace for 12 months, effectively muzzling the editor with the threat of further action for any new offence. After the gag order, Okane took to publishing a black-edged death notice in every paper for the death of the Northern miner, with a large title of RIP and signed T. Okane, gagged editor. By 1883, the Northern miner was thriving, and he enhanced its operations by installing a new Bremer printing machine capable of printing 1,200 copies an hour, saving several hours of printing time compared to a hand press. It operated by steam, the first for any paper north of Rockhampton. During this year, he also took on his son John Jack Okane, who had followed his father to Charters Towers that year, as a partner in the paper. By now, the Northern Miner was published 6 days a week, and Okane claimed a circulation of 1,000 copies per day, or 6,000 a week, while the Towers Herald, his main rivals, sold 250 copies an issue. Okane became an alderman from 1880 to 83 and 1884 to 87, as well as a prominent member of the Chamber of Commerce, Hospital Board and School of the Arts. He was passionate about improving life for the working classes and pushed for the building of the new brick hospital, still in use today, as well as the creation of Milchester State School and the School of Mines. He wrote articles on how there were too many children in Charters Towers and Milchester not attending school, saying, "Parents must learn that schooling is as necessary for the minds of their children as the daily bread and beef for their bodies." And the Department of Public Instruction eventually agreed to apply the compulsory clauses of the Education Act so that all children in the town must attend school. By 1889, Okane's health was declining, and he ceased to be editor in practice by October that year. Suffering several attacks of paralysis, possibly mini strokes, his health went rapidly downhill, and he began to have difficulty breathing, as well as showing signs of dementia. He was taken to Brisbane for medical treatment, but when he didn't show any signs of improvement, his family wanted to bring him home to Charters Towers. His doctors forbade it, saying the journey would certainly kill him. He went to the home of one of his daughters in Ipswich and died there on the 17th of May 1890, aged 70. His funeral was attended by Brisbane members of Parliament, and floral tributes were sent by editors of papers all around Queensland, with one from Frederick Pfeiffer of Charters Towers, representing the miners of the town. Obituaries for Dias Okane were published in newspapers Australia-wide. Dias Okane was added to the Australian Media Hall of Fame in 2018. The Northern Miner continued to run as the voice of Charters Towers until 2020. The Chinese were an important part of the early gold rush years on many goldfields, yet so little trace is left of their presence today. William Lam Pan was believed to have been born in Canton in the Sunwuyi district around 1840 to William Lam Chang, a medical doctor, and Annie Shoy. He emigrated to Australia around 1870, spending 8 months at the Cape River diggings, then moving on to Gilberton, where he spent 3 years. While there, it's believed he proved his medical abilities, as an article attests that a Chinese doctor was called to attend a miner injured in an explosion. Once the miner was patched up and taken to the hospital, the Western doctor there said he need not have come, as the miner's fractured and severely lacerated thigh had already been saved by the care given by the Chinese doctor. It is usually believed that this doctor was William Lam Pan. In 1876, testimonials were published in the Northern Advocate, one stating, "I hereby certify that I have for the last 2 years known Dr. Lam Pan as a Chinese physician practicing on this goldfield. In the absence of a European doctor, he has to my own knowledge treated some severe cases of broken limbs among the European portion of the miners with great success, and has always borne a high character for probity as well as skill, and leaving, bears with him my best wishes for his future success. Howard St. George, Gold Commissioner." However, no registration has ever been found for William Lam Pan to practice as a doctor in Queensland, and his profession was usually listed as herbalist. He journeyed to Charters Towers sometime in 1873 and settled in Milchester, where there was a mining settlement and Chinese community already in place. In 1876, William married Mary Jane MacDonald, a widow aged 24, then applied for naturalisation as a British citizen. He is listed as being 38 years old. Their marriage was brief, as Mary Jane died in 1881, aged 29. By 1882, William was able to apply for more land in the Milchester area. He gained 2 market gardens, one at Gladstone Creek close to his home, and one at Deary's Creek, as well as miners' rights over his lands. That same year, he became a partner in Wing Yet, Lam Pan & Co. General Store, located on the banks of the creek. His next marriage in 1884 to Sarah Maloney was more successful. Sarah, a young Irish woman, was listed on her marriage certificate as aged 25. However, there is some belief she may actually have only been 19. William was 45. They had 6 children. During this busy time, William's business ventures were flourishing. He bought out his partner Wing Yet for his shares in the general store, and in 1886 applied for a business area. The handwritten application supplies proof that William was able to read and write in English. That he had become a man of means are shown by the description of his house on the business area application, to the value of about £200, consisting of a weatherboard house with iron roof. In an era where many homes were still bark or calico humpy constructions, this would have been a house of some standing. His status grew, and as a long-term resident and successful herbalist and store owner, William Lam Pan came to be seen as a boss of the Chinese community. William Lam Pan's standing was confirmed when he was invited to meet the governor in 1899 on a visit to Charters Towers, and he presented an address to him on behalf of the Chinese community. Sarah Lam Pan died in 1901 of pulmonary tuberculosis. Her age on her death certificate is listed as 35, which suggests she was much younger on her marriage than that certificate claimed. Their children thrived at school, and when William died in 1910, aged 69, many of them moved away to the Burdekin area, and from there spread across Australia, with descendants now living in Townsville, Melbourne, and Sydney. Of the bustling Chinese communities in Charters Towers at Milchester and in town in Guards Lane, now known as Lee Street, there is little to no trace remaining. A few artefacts are held at the Zara Clark Museum, including a large wooden sign carved with Chinese characters and which supposedly hung outside a store, as well as a few ceramic pots and jars and some grave markers. Some family lines still continue in the town, but otherwise, the hundreds of store owners, market gardeners, herbalists, gambling house owners and families seem to have vanished into the mist. And William Lam Pan, doctor and herbalist, storekeeper and business owner, father and community representative, vanished along with them. The men and women of Charters Towers have always been quick to answer the call to arms in times of war. But Hugh Quinn's bravery under fire will long be remembered in the town he called home. Hugh was born on the 6th of May 1888. The family lived in Rutherford Street, and the children, Hugh, his brother Francis, and sister Frances Alice, who sadly died at the age of 11, attended Milchester School before the boys were sent to Dixon School for Boys at Southport on the Gold Coast. Returning to Charters Towers after finishing school, Hugh began work with Cummins and Campbell Chartered Accountants and Auditors, quickly becoming head clerk. In his years in Charters Towers, Hugh played senior football and became known as an excellent amateur boxer. Solid of build but agile on feet, he developed into the quickest light heavyweight boxer in North Queensland. In 1906, he had joined the C Company of the 2nd Infantry of the Kennedy Regiment, a local militia unit, and rose through the ranks in the following years to become captain in 1912. On the outbreak of war, Hugh Quinn and other volunteers from the Kennedy Regiment went to enlist in the 15th Battalion of the AIF in Brisbane. Hugh was once again put in charge of a company, and the new battalion began extensive training at Enoggera. Hugh and his battalion landed at Anzac Cove on the 26th of April, 1915. Captain Quinn and his men were ordered to take an entrenched post at the head of Monash Valley. Quinn and C Company struggled up the steep hill slope to the shoulder of the ridge. Then, under fire from Turkish snipers, they sprinted forward across open ground to take cover in a string of shallow rifle pits less than 10 yards below the line of the crest. Exhausted diggers of the 14th Battalion handed over the pits and ran back down the ridge. C Company held the position alone, in the centre of the Anzac front lines. The Anzac front was more or less stable, and the 150 yards of trenches that C Company occupied were marked up. From then on, the position was known among Australians as Quinn's Post. Once the post had been secured, there was a constant battle to hold it every day for 8 months. The danger lay in the fact that it was positioned just below the enemy position, and a careless lift of the head above the trench was an immediate target of the Turkish snipers. On that first afternoon, Quinn's company lost 11 men, killed or wounded. After a week under fire, Quinn handed over the post to another company, and C Company moved back down into Monash Valley for a much-needed reprieve. By the 9th of May, Quinn, now promoted to Major, was back in Quinn's Post with his company. By now, the 15th Battalion had lost over half their men. Overnight, he led his company as part of a battalion-wide surprise night attack to win the Turkish trenches on the other side of the crest. They drove the enemy out on their charge, but had to fall back after a strong counterattack. More than 200 Australians were killed or wounded that night. Quinn's company returned to the post several times to relieve other companies. There were constant attempts at assaults by the Australians, and the losses were heavy. On the 29th of May, the Turks fired their mines, and the 3 front trenches of Quinn's Post blew sky high. The enemy soldiers rushed over the crest in the confusion and stormed the lines, taking several of the Australian-held trenches. A protracted battle followed. Then the post commander, Colonel Chauvel, told Major Quinn that he and his men must charge and drive them out, but by this time it was nearly light, and knowing his men would be vulnerable to fire over the open ground, Quinn was reluctant to condemn his men to certain death. He assembled his company, but returned to Chauvel to try to convince him it would be better to close in slowly on the Turkish flanks. After several postponements of the charge while they argued, Chauvel told Quinn he could no longer put it off. Quinn climbed back up to his men, unhappy about his orders. Quinn twice placed his whistle between his teeth as if to give the signal, but removed it again, deciding to go to the front line and reconnoitre it for himself before he ordered his men to charge. Calling over Lieutenant McSharry, he told him of his plan to reconnoitre, and they ran up the main communication trench to the heart of number 3 to see the position there. As he climbed up the last stretch, a shot rang out and he fell back dead, almost into McSharry's arms. Major Hugh Quinn was just 27 years old and the first company commander of a battalion to be killed in Gallipoli. He was buried in Shrapnel Valley. Hugh's death delayed the planned attack, and when the Australian soldiers finally went over the top, the Turkish soldiers were charging, which meant the enemy guns couldn't fire on them for fear of hitting their own men. The diggers took back their trenches and beat back the assault. Far fewer Australian lives were lost that day because of that delay. Many soldiers, doctors, nurses and personnel enlisted from Charters Towers in every war since the Boer War. Many never returned. Their names are listed on honour boards in schools, City Hall and memorials around Charters Towers. For such a small town, the loss of so many lives changed the course of families and businesses and left a hole in the heart of the community. For his bravery and sacrifice, Hugh Quinn is remembered proudly. Not many people today recognise the name of Hope Charteris, but in her day she represented the cultural hopes of a town. Born in Ipswich in 1888 as Elizabeth Ann Brown to Mary and William Brown, coal miners who had emigrated from Wales, the family moved to Charters Towers in the 1890s, where her father became manager of the New Victoria and Caledonia Gold Mine Limited. Growing up in the Towers, she was soon noticed for her beautiful singing voice and won various Eisteddfods and competitions, first in Charters Towers and then further afield. Aged 18, she won a competition in Sydney and performed for well-known singer Ada Crossley, who strongly advised her parents to send her to England for further tuition. The people of Charters Towers took her cause to their hearts and held concerts and benefits to raise money for her tuition fees at the Royal Academy of London. A large concert was put on by the Charters Towers leader Tefel and contributed all the takings to the Miss Lizzie Brown Tuition Fund. When enough money had been raised, a farewell dinner was held in the Australian Natives Association Hall. A small concert followed, including some songs by Lizzie herself, as well as other local women, and a tea was served. She left Australia and arrived in London in 1909. There she began her studies at the Royal Academy and was noted for the tone and quality of her voice. She took on a role at the Shaftesbury Theatre as understudy, but soon appeared in the role in her own right. A reviewer, after seeing her performance, said, "I heard her sing. I was charmed with her style and the quality of her tone. Chatting with her during the evening, I found her, like most colonials, the personification of frank unaffectedness." Lizzie took on the stage name of Hope Charteris, supposedly after the street her family had lived in, Hope Street, and the town which had believed in her talents. During World War I, she became known for singing a song called Cooee to the Australian soldiers in London at variety concerts. Her own brother David was killed in action in 1918 and was awarded the Military Cross. By the 1920s, she was a well-known performer in musical comedies and pantomimes, as well as operatic numbers. In 1923, she returned to Australia to star in a pantomime of Aladdin at His Majesty's Theatre in Melbourne. Now firmly back in Australia, she settled in Sydney and in 1936 took part in an Australia-wide radio broadcast concert by the ABC for the Australian Association of Welsh Societies. Hope fades from the headlines until in 1950 a concert was held in Charters Towers for a Back to the World reunion at the Theatre Royal. The Northern Miner stated that visitors were to include many old Towers musical artists. They would have the honour of hearing Hope Charteris, who as a young woman left Charters to study music and was now living in Townsville, having recently arrived in the north from Sydney. It's not known exactly when Hope married, but her husband is believed to have been a Peter Robertson. Hope died in a nursing home in Sydney in 1981, aged 93. It may seem strange that the small mining town was so passionate about sending a young woman off to seek her musical career in the world. However, Charters Towers has always had a great love of music and theatre, right from its earliest beginnings. Starved for entertainment, and so far from the bigger cities, the miners, station owners and storekeepers of the town formed many musical clubs, held Eisteddfods, and happily embraced travelling shows, turning out in the hundreds to watch. It began small in the dozens of hotels around town. In 1887, the Theatre Royal opened on Hodgkinson Street behind the Excelsior Hotel. A large wooden hall, it became the cultural centre of the goldfields. It was the scene of many exhibitions, political meetings, dances, concerts and Eisteddfods. Dame Nellie Melba performed for a large crowd there in 1909. Later it became a cinema and was finally demolished in 1969. String orchestras and brass bands started in the town in the 1870s, with the Apollo Orchestra starting in the 1890s. The large Welsh and German populations in Charters Towers formed their own choirs, like the Liedertafel, who sponsored Hope Charteris's beginnings. These choirs performed to great acclaim and even won state competitions. The very first Eisteddfod, a Welsh tradition, was held in Charters Towers in 1889 before it spread to the rest of Queensland. By the 1930s, the era of touring companies was fading as the mining boom of the town died out, the Depression kicked in, and the popularity of cinemas overtook the desire for live entertainment. However, Charters Towers still has a strong theatrical, dance and musical tradition to this day, and performers from the towers still head out into the wider world to find their own successful careers. Hope was just the first of many. Little is really known about the nomadic and mysterious woman known as Annie Baggs, but few individuals have sparked the imagination like the legend of the Wandering Woman of the North. Believed to have been born around 1850, Anne Ferdinand probably came to Australia in the early 1880s. Some say she came from a family of minor nobility in Prussia, Germany or Austria, and that she had fallen in love, only to be jilted or that her lover died and came to Australia to track him down or escape her grief. First newspaper reports placed her in the far north in 1889, when Annie Ferdinand was sentenced to 6 months imprisonment for vagrancy. She travelled all over northern Queensland, camping or sleeping in people's sheds. She was a renowned animal lover and rescued stray or injured animals, and if she came across animal bones, would gather them up and place them under bridges, saying she was bringing them peace. Annie was described by many as thin, with weather-beaten skin and hair that hung in matted strings. She initially wore ragged clothing, faded by the sun and patched as they fell apart. Later, she began to wear clothing fashioned from bags, and that, with the great pile of bags in which she carried her possessions, earned her the name of Annie Baggs. A reader of the Townsville Bulletin submitted a memory of a bush journey in 1887, when he and his companions came across Annie in the Hinchinbrook country during a downpour. In conversation, she told them she was on a mission, helped by good spirits, and told them something which she repeated to many people over the years. I have to spend 7 years in rags, 7 years in bags, then 7 years in silks. This story became part of her legend, and many believed she was following this dictate to win back her love. She came to Charters Towers for the first time in 1904, as documented by a reporter for the Evening Telegraph newspaper of Charters Towers. The renowned Annie Baggs, the quaint apostle of vegetarianism, is about to visit Charters Towers for the first time. She has travelled on foot from Townsville to Selholme, where she is at present. In a week's time, she expects to be in Charters Towers. In age, she is about 40, of German birth and with a bronzed, rather refined German face, which is also enlightened and pleasant. Short undressed, dull grey hair, dilapidated raiment, and bare brown feet underneath. She is accomplished in music and will sit for hours at a piano where she gets the chance. She is pleasant in manner and converses volubly, endeavouring to impress upon all she meets the great benefits to be derived from practising vegetarianism. She is a great favourite with children everywhere. Another writer to a local paper told the story of meeting her at Southern Cross, just outside Charters Towers in 1905. That night, as guests arrived for a party, she appeared from the shed and walked into the parlour where the piano sat and began to play dance music. Nobody objected as her playing was so good, but they complained about the lack of a break between dances. She played for hours and wouldn't leave the instrument until a cruel trick was played on her by the local schoolmaster. He held out a coin to her, and as she lifted her hands from the keyboard to reach for it, another man closed the lid and locked it. The schoolmaster dropped the coin on the floor, where it rolled into a crack in the floorboards. She asked for a hammer to prise up the board and get her coin, but was told she'd get another one if she left and went to bed. Annie's eccentricities and vulnerability meant she was the subject of many small cruelties and accusations. Children would sometimes throw rocks at her or set their dogs to fight with hers. She was accused of stealing and on at least one occasion appeared in court, apparently having stolen tea, sugar, soda and cream of tartar from a Mr. Harry Smith's house in 1905. The defendant was charged as she did not appear of sane mind. Some parents used her as a type of boogeyman to scare the children into good behaviour, telling them, "Be good, or Annie Bags will get you." In later years, it seemed Annie may have completed her 7 years in rags and 7 years in bags, as she began to dress in a better class of clothing, although it was still clearly second-hand. Many remember her as kind, intelligent, polite, and ready to defend her opinions and herself. In 1910, Annie was found ill and emaciated at her camp and was sent from the Charters Towers Hospital to Townsville Reception House. The next day, she died. Her cause of death was listed as phthisis, now known as tuberculosis. Her age was listed as 59. She was buried in Belgian Gardens Cemetery. After her death, the legend of Annie Bags grew, and stories about her became more and more elaborate. It has been said that she had £400 to £700 in her savings upon her death. The story of her lost love has been embroidered until no one knows which version was true. He was a prince killed in a duel. He was a sailor lost at sea. He ran away with a housemaid. He promised to marry her but came to Australia. She followed for revenge, or she followed to live with him to reunite and live happily ever after. No one really knows her story. But somehow, although few really knew her, the romance of her mysterious, lonely and independent existence has wormed its way into the hearts and imaginations of the town. The Charters Towers Hospital and the doctors and nurses who have dedicated their lives to the health and well-being of Charters Towers have had a far-reaching effect, not just in the town, but in the world. One of these nurses was Rosa Okane, only daughter of Jack and Jeannie Okane, granddaughter of the Northern Miner editor and writer, the Dias Okane. By 1911, Rosa embarked on a career in nursing. She trained at the Charters Towers and Townsville hospitals, living with her mother in Ryan Street, before accepting a posting in Winton, where she became matron in 1917. The Charters Towers Hospital main building, as it exists now, was opened in 1884, the brick building replacing the original timber hospital, which was built on the site in 1876. The very first hospital on the Charters Towers Goldfield was a sapling and bark construction in Mossman Street. The main building was added to over the years, with a children's ward, nurses' quarters, and surgeons' residence. The deer and goat-proof fence was shipped from Liverpool in England and still graces the Gill Street side of the grounds today. In its heyday of the early 1900s, the Charters Towers Hospital was deemed to be the most modern and well-equipped hospital in the north of Australia. Not long after her posting to Winton, Rosa was called up for duty to the Australian Army Nursing Service. She was sent for training on field nursing at Kangaroo Point. Australian nurses have served in theatres of war since the Boer War of 1900. They've served on battleships as well as field hospitals on the front lines, often in range of artillery. By the end of World War I, 23 nurses had been killed in service. Sister Rosa Okane's company left Sydney aboard the HMAT Wairema in October 1918 on their way to Albany in Western Australia, with the end destination of Thessalonica in Greece. However, during their journey, armistice was declared, and so the Wairema turned around and they disembarked in Fremantle in December 1918. At the same time, another troop ship, the HMAT Boona, was returning from Cape Town, with 400 of their 1,000 soldiers infected with the Spanish influenza, which was sweeping the globe in the wake of the war. The infected soldiers of the HMAT Boona were confined to the Woodman Point quarantine station, and the nurses from the Wairema volunteered to nurse them, despite knowing the danger exposure to the highly contagious disease. Of the volunteers, 27 nurses were selected, including Rosa Okane. 11 days later, Rosa died of pneumonia from the effects of the influenza, aged 30 years old. Thanks to the tireless nursing they received, only 26 of the 400 infected soldiers died. In 1933, the West Australian published a description of Rosa's burial by one of the quarantine nurses. Between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. on a beautiful moonlit night, 4 sailors carried the body, wrapped in a winding sheet of the Union Jack, to the mortuary out in the scrub. Later in the day, the burial took place at the quarantine station. The nurses made little wreaths from West Australian wildflowers, which were placed on the coffin. I did not leave the grave until the last post was sounded. The people of Charters Towers formed a patriotic committee and funded the raising of a monument for Rosa at Woodman Point. It still stands there today, amongst the peaceful coastal scrub where the quarantine station once stood. The plaque reads, "For Valour, in honoured and revered memory of Sister Rosa Okane, AAN Service, late of Charters Towers, Queensland. Died here 21st December 1918 of pneumonic influenza. Only daughter of Mrs. J. Okane and sister of Francis and John Okane. R.I.P. Erected by the Patriotic Committee, Charters Towers, Comrade Nurses and Queensland Friends." Many other medical staff from Charters Towers Hospital enlisted in the war efforts. Among them was a young nurse named Sarah McElroy. Sarah was born in Charters Towers on the 18th of May 1892 and enlisted in 1917, aged 25. She and another local nurse, Nurse Crabe, were sent to Bombay in India. On return after the armistice, they were faced with the outbreak of the influenza in Charters Towers. Because of their field nursing experience, they volunteered to head the isolation ward, formerly the children's ward at the Charters Towers Hospital. At one point, the ward housed 22 cases at once. Thankfully, the tide of the epidemic turned and the danger passed by the end of 1919. Nurse Sarah McElroy married Francis Okane, Rosa's brother, in 1924. Many people remember and commemorate the war effort of the brave soldiers, naval officers and airmen who enlisted from Charters Towers. But we must also remember to give thanks to the medical staff, doctors and nurses who battled alongside them. Some, like Sister Rosa Okane, even made the ultimate sacrifice. These are just some of the extraordinary people that have made Charters Towers what it is today. Many people have built this great city. All around us we see evidence from the past, from the landscape to the historic buildings. For many, the towers will always be known as the world.